I'll assume that most viewers are at least somewhat familiar with one or both of the two properties I'll be discussing here, but it'll be easier to make my point if I lay the groundwork down first. When first being introduced to Warhammer 40,000, you'll quickly learn three things. First, the Emperor protects. Second, 40k is a setting, not a story. And third, shovel. For the sake of brevity, I'll be skipping the first and third points and focusing mainly on the second. Most works of fiction follow a central cast of characters following a central plotline. If the story is set in a fictional world, then the world will often move largely around the central characters, and the actions of the characters will usually have a pretty big impact on the world. This isn't a bad thing, it's just how most stories work. A perfect example of this is what I imagine most of you are here for, the second half of this video's title, Star Wars, specifically the original trilogy. The core story of those three films is Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker and the interactions that arise because of their differing loyalties. Vader is a high-ranking member of the Empire. Luke is a farm boy whose home was destroyed by the Empire. Luke joins the Rebel Alliance, a group trying to stop the Empire, and as he grows he becomes a Jedi, a type of space wizard religion, to counter Vader's own brand of space wizardry called Sith. I know that rushing and simplifying all these descriptions will probably make some people very irate, but I am trying to be brief. When Luke learns of the personal connection between the two of them, he tries and succeeds in convincing Vader to change sides, both politically and religiously, redeeming Vader from these two objectively evil groups. And no, it's not just a certain point of view, the Sith are absolutely evil. Murder is part of their religion. The right to personal expression does not include murder. Back on topic, so I just threw a lot of weird words and phrases around, but the thing is that most of them don't actually matter to the core story and the interactions between Luke and Vader. Vader could be an Amazon executive and Luke could have grown up working in a family-owned high street shop, and the main conflict between the two wouldn't actually change very much. There would probably be fewer dead people, but the central conflict of interest between the two men wouldn't change much. I'm not trying to diss the setting or world building of the original Star Wars. If Star Wars had been some business drama, then it probably wouldn't have had the same popularity and staying power that it did. The fantastic and imaginative world building is a big reason, maybe even the main reason, that Star Wars became so beloved. My point is that all the world building doesn't actually affect the main story beyond a superficial level. It's mostly window dressing. The prequel trilogy didn't really change that. Those films massively expanded the setting and introduced a host of new characters, many with well-developed stories of their own, but the core of the Star Wars prequels was still Vader/Anakin, and his story. The setting still largely moved around him, and he caused massive changes to it. The point of the new world building was to build and expand upon one character. The setting exists for the characters to change it. Warhammer 40k is almost the exact opposite of this. The original Star Wars can be described as the story of Luke and Vader, but there is no equivalent of that in 40k. There is no central narrative or consistent cast of characters which move and change the whole galaxy, or who lore was written just to expand upon them. In 40k, the world building all came first, and characters were added afterwards to give the audience something to engage with. Personally, I think this comes from the intention of each IP. While Star Wars was a traditional story, 40k was, and still is, a tabletop miniature wargame. All the lore and stories in 40k began as explanations for why your little plastic models looked the way they did and why they were fighting each other. These stories were small and personal, allowing the character to experience personally momentous events without changing the setting as a whole. The 40k book, The Infinite and the Divine, is a good example of what I mean. The book is mainly about the rivalry between the two main characters, Trazyn and Orican. The two characters go through a lot over the course of the story, and both experience some personally important things. However, the 40k setting as a whole is almost entirely unaffected by the events of the book, at least as of the making of this video. All the world building and characters of 40k exist to give flavour to a game. Games Workshop, the owners of Warhammer, weren't interested in changing their game, so they didn't need some central narrative to change the lore of it. The title and premise of this video is that these two franchises are switching styles. Star Wars is changing from a centralized story to a setting where smaller stories take place, and 40k is changing from a wide setting to a handful of more concise and focused stories. I really should have said this at the onset, but this is just a personal observation. I am not some authority on either franchise, so feel free to ignore everything in this video. It is just my opinion. You'll also notice I've said they're switching styles, not that they have already switched. I'll start with Star Wars. The story of Luke and Vader finished in the 1980s. The prequels fleshed out that story, but they didn't move beyond it. Although earlier I described the world building of Star Wars as window dressing for the main story, it was damn good window dressing. To just let the world of Star Wars finish because its main story was over would honestly feel like a waste of potential. So when Disney bought Star Wars from George Lucas, they did try to set up a new central story with the sequel trilogy and Rey Palpatine, but that didn't really work out. Why that happened is a topic of debate, let's be diplomatic here, so that's something you can discuss in the comment section of other channels because I'm not interested in doing it here. Rather than try and push a core story that wasn't really working, Disney decided to step back and tell smaller stories closer to the time of Luke and Vader, The Mandalorian being the first example of this. By doing this, I think Disney Star Wars unintentionally locked the setting of Star Wars in place. Every new story that Disney have told in the Star Wars universe since the Rise of Skywalker has been set before the sequel trilogy. Many videos have been made about the odd world building of the sequels, but by the time of The Force Awakens, the Star Wars galaxy has to be in a certain state and all factions in a certain place. To avoid further confusing their own movies, Disney has had to keep the stories they're telling to a certain smaller scale, where nothing the characters do can have a massive impact on the state of the galaxy at large. I don't think Disney has quite realised they've put themselves in this box yet, since Ahsoka is trying to build Thrawn and his Imperial remnant as some terrible threat that could destroy the New Republic and rebuild the Empire, yet we know he's not going to do that since the New Republic is still standing by the time of the sequels. The tension of the threat is killed by the restrictions it's under. But, Ahsoka aside, most of the Disney Star Wars stories released to date have been smaller and more personal in scale, with less of the galaxy-changing events that the Luke and Vader central story had. The Star Wars universe has changed from being the backdrop of the main character's conflict to the setting that forces the events of the lives of smaller characters like Cassian Andor and The Mandalorian. As for why I think 40k is making the reverse change, I think it's basically because 40k did the opposite thing from Star Wars. While Star Wars accidentally blocked itself from expanding the story, 40k has kind of forced itself to expand the story. As I said earlier, the point of 40k stories was basically to give backstory for plastic models in a tabletop game. I think that Games Workshop gave their toy armies too much backstory, and now it's almost become a perpetual storytelling device. Every story written to make a little plastic man interesting and something you'd want to buy lays the groundwork for more stories about that character, that faction, and the world they're interacting with. Again, an example, Games Workshop decided to do a full-length book stories for the origin of the human factions in 40k, called The Horus Heresy. The first book was released in 2006, long before I was introduced to the franchise, but from what I can find online it seems it was originally intended just to expand the background lore. As time went on, however, the series took on a life of its own, and the final book in the series was released just this year in 2024 with a total of 64 books in the main series in total, and a separate tabletop miniature wargame of its own. However, unlike 40k, the Horus Heresy wasn't a setting, and it did have an explicit story to tell, namely the origin of the 40k galaxy as it is now. As a prequel series, most of the characters had to finish in certain places, aligned to certain factions, but the many characters' whole purpose was to cause galaxy-changing events to lead up and bring about the setting of 40k. These characters are the Primarchs, and I do not have time to even come close to properly explaining them. So a very long story, very, very short. They are basically the sons of God, except not really, and half of them serve different gods anyway. It's not even close to being accurate, but you get the idea. They are big deals, both narratively and in universe. Changing things and getting things done was their whole point. This wouldn't really have caused major changes in 40k itself, except for a decision Games Workshop made in 2016. Magnus the Red, one of these Primarchs and a major character in the Horus Heresy, was brought into the 40k setting. A few months later, another of these Primarchs, Guilliman, though it's not his real name but that's impronounceable, was also brought into 40k. Like Disney, I don't think Games Workshop really understood what they were doing there. 40k was, as stated, a setting. It was static, with lots of things happening, but nothing ever actually changes. And I think you can actually see the problem here. Characters who exist to get stuff done and change things are going to get stuff done and change things whether the setting wants them to or not. By bringing these inherently dynamic characters into the setting, the writers at Games Workshop are forced to make the setting itself more dynamic to accommodate them. Now, despite all I've just said, things still haven't changed too much for 40k. When it's only one or two of these world-moving characters, then you can still sort of freeze the setting in place. But as of the making of this video, another Primarch, the Lion, is about to return, and a large part of the fandom is getting quite hyped about what sort of waves he and his mustache are going to make. There are anywhere between 18 and 21 Primarchs, depending how you count them all, and while some of them are definitely never coming back, rest in hell Conrad Kurz, you can bet that at least a dozen of them will probably be brought back into 40k. If you bring these big, important, world-changing characters into the setting, you need to use them. They are just too significant in universe and narratively to just be window dressing. Their mere presence demands a large world-changing narrative. So why is Games Workshop doing this? Changing a setting they were fine to leave static for decades? Money. Money, basically. That's kind of a good explanation for anything Games Workshop does. 40k is still a tabletop miniature wargame, and every Primarch they've released so far has sold like hotcakes. I don't even collect the Lions faction, the Dark Angels, and I still want his model. I mean, look at it. King Arthur wishes he had that kind of drip. And on that note, I think I'll end my argument. Star Wars can't tell a central story anymore and has to rely on ancillary stories, and 40k is painting itself into a corner where it has no choice but to tell a central story. As for whether I think either of these changes are a good or a bad thing, I'm not really going to say. I don't really care enough about Star Wars either way, and although I'm comfortable I've been into 40k long enough to no longer be called a tourist, I don't feel I'm invested enough to call for changes one way or the other. And anyway, this is all just things that I've personally noticed in two franchises I'm casually interested in. I actually spent more of my effort on making changes to a world of my own, and now it's time for the real purpose of this video, self-advertisement. I have written a book and I want you to read it, please. Please. The basic idea is how folklore monsters like vampires and werewolves would integrate into a sci-fi setting. The book's called Footnotes of Humanity's Future, and it's a collection of short stories set a few centuries in the future where some fantasy creatures live in space. If that sounds like your kind of thing, then check it out on Amazon. I would appreciate it. I've put a lot of work into it, and literally no one has read it yet, not even my sister, which kind of says a lot about our sibling dynamic. Anyway, enough self-pity. Thank you very much for watching, and may you have a quiet day.